that they didn't have. Until the Russians finally completed the Bushehr reactor, which is now in operation. And the Russians tried to sell additional reactors to Iran, which I'm sure that they will purchase in due course. You know, one of the reasons I'm so worried about the current security situation is that with the Bushehr reactor now in operation, it's the first time that an adversary state to Israel has been able to put a commercial size and scope reactor into operation. Other countries have had research reactors. Iran has one in Tehran. Bushehr is the first reactor in a hostile state actually to be burning nuclear fuel. In 1981, faced with Saddam Hussein's Osirak reactor being constructed outside of Baghdad, Israel struck and destroyed it. Faced with a reactor being constructed out in the Syrian desert, in September of 2007, Israel destroyed that. That reactor was particularly interesting. It was being built by North Koreans. It was a clone, an exact duplicate of the North Korean reactor at Yongbyon. Now, do we think that the North Koreans were working in Syria because they share a common border? Because they have a long cultural history together? Because they have a common view of the world? Of course not. The North Koreans were in Syria in partnership, I'm sure we will find someday, with Iran. Because Syria alone didn't have the money to build that reactor. Iran did. Iran and North Korea had a common interest. When you're trying to hide illicit nuclear activities from international scrutiny, what better place to hide them than in a country that nobody's looking? And one of the reasons I think we will find that Iran is willing to shed so much Syrian blood today to keep the Assad family dictatorship in power is because there are other nuclear-related activities still underway inside Syria. But the point is that faced with this threat, Israel has twice destroyed reactors before they became operational. Bushehr is now in operation, and in due course, it will produce in the spent fuel that will come out of the reactor enough plutonium to fashion nuclear weapons. A different route, an alternative route to the uranium enrichment route that Iran is also pursuing. Again, when I was at the State Department, I asked the Department of Energy, what is the capacity of Bushehr to produce plutonium for use as nuclear weapons? And the Department of Energy said, you know, if you ran a comparable size reactor, the way a prudent electricity company would run such a reactor with one fuel load in the reactor, one, maybe two, let's just say one load of spent fuel in the cooling ponds nearby, and one load of fuel ready to go into the reactor, just 3 loads. If you burn that in typically commercial ways, you would produce enough plutonium in the spent fuel of the Bushehr reactor after 5 years of operation, enough plutonium for 50 to 60 nuclear weapons. So Bushehr is already online and may well be immune from attack, because if you attack a reactor that's in operation, you're going to release radiation, in that case, into the Persian Gulf and into the atmosphere. So one opportunity has already been missed. The question now is what to do about Iran's uranium enrichment capability. From publicly available data from the International Atomic Energy Agency, we know that there's enough low-enriched uranium for reactors that if it were enriched to weapons grade level, would already be enough to produce 4 nuclear weapons. And every day that goes by, those enrichment centrifuges continue to spin. Iran is on the verge of, or has already, started a new enrichment facility at the deeply buried and hardened Fordo location near the city of Qum. I am profoundly worried that there are other sites inside Iran that we don't know about that could survive attack because the Iranians have learned a lot from their friends in North Korea about burying and concealing and protecting sensitive locations. Now, the response of the West over the years has been, well, let's try diplomacy. Let's see if we can't negotiate with Iran. This is the approach of reasonable people. There's only one problem. The Iranians are not reasonable about their nuclear weapons program. And anyway, what would negotiation achieve? It's the position of the United States and the West that we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. It's obviously the intention of Iran that they want nuclear weapons. What exactly is the compromise position that negotiations are supposed to achieve? That Iran gets to keep a small nuclear weapons program? That we trust Iran with peaceful uses only when they've demonstrated repeatedly over the years that they don't warrant our trust? They've lied to the IAEA, they've concealed their program, they've falsified records, and on and on and on. The fact is that Iran is not going to be chit-chatted out of this nuclear weapons program. So as the alternative, people say, let's impose economic sanctions. Let's make them pay a price for their pursuit of nuclear weapons. But what price have they paid? The Obama administration's Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, testified to Congress 2 weeks ago that all of the existing sanctions had not caused Iran to change its behavior or policies in the nuclear field at all. Not at all. So when you hear the spin and the hype of the new round of sanctions that have been imposed by Congress and by the European Union, you have to bear in mind the history. Iran hasn't been waiting around to be sanctioned. They've been preparing alternatives. They've been preparing ways to evade the sanctions. And in any event, the race that we're in leaves Iran so much closer to achieving nuclear weapons than for the sanctions to work that it's not even close. The Obama administration's Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, said a few days ago that he thought Iran was within a year of producing a nuclear weapon. I think they're even closer than that. But we don't really know, because our intelligence about what's going on inside Iran is, to say the least, less than perfect. What we don't know is not good news. It can only mean there are other Iranian capabilities. Sanctions only work when they're massively applied, swiftly, uniformly abided by, and enforced. None of that has been true of the existing sanctions. None of that is true of the new round of sanctions. Iran, in the most likely outcome, is going to get nuclear weapons. There's only one way, in my judgment, that that's going to be avoided. And that's if somebody decides to use preemptive military force to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. That's the reality. Now, the Obama administration, I'm afraid, has a plan B. And the plan B is, well, we don't like Iran with nuclear weapons, but we can contain and deter Iran the same way we contained and deterred the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Ladies and gentlemen, that is delusional. Iran is not subject to the same psychology that prevailed in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. When you value life in the hereafter more than life on Earth, you're not subject to being deterred. That's the fundamental reality. But even if I were wrong, even if Iran could be contained and deterred, the fault with the administration's plan B is that the proliferation doesn't stop with Iran. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will, Turkey will, others in the region will, so that in a very short period of time you can have half a dozen or more nuclear weapon states. This is an inherently unstable situation in a very dangerous part of the world, which is why I have been fixated this last 10 years on stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons in the first place. I wish I could tell you that the United States was prepared to use force because the Iranian nuclear weapons capability is not simply a threat to Israel. It's a threat to the United States. It's a weapon of terror against our innocent civilians. But I have to say, I see no prospect that the administration would act with military force. That's why the spotlight is on Israel. This is not about spin or psychology or hype. Israel is being driven by the physical reality that Iran every day is another day closer to nuclear weapons. Israel does not have an infinite amount of time within which to make a judgment. The Obama administration has pressured the government of Israel mercilessly for 3 years not to use military force. They have implicitly threatened not to resupply Israel for what could be very heavy losses if Israel decides to attack key aspects of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I think we can see that the administration's efforts to pressure Israel have failed, and so they have gone public. That's why the defense secretary said that he thought Israel's timetable for attack might be April, May, or June of this year. Have you ever heard of a situation where the United States, with a key ally that faces an existential threat, has told its adversary when the attack time is going to be? Have you ever heard that? Did you see in the New York Times on Sunday the usual unnamed administration sources saying Israel didn't have the capability to attack Iran, and telling the government of Iran what planes, what capabilities Israel would use? The fact is the administration has gone public because they know their private pressure has failed. Now they've got one more chance for private pressure when Prime Minister Netanyahu comes here on the 5th of March and they have another meeting in the Oval Office. Ladies and gentlemen, it will not be a pleasant meeting, because President Obama will say, Bibi, I hope you don't plan on using military force. And I am very confident that Prime Minister Netanyahu will say, Mr. President, we will defend Israel, period. Very clear that if Israel makes a decision to use military force preemptively against the Iranian program, this would constitute a legitimate exercise of Israel's right of self-defense. So everybody should understand that. What should the United States do? What should our response be? The answer is